Hello and welcome to This is Your Brain on Drugs Psychiatry Podcast. It's your host, Dr. Cody Armstrong, punk rock psychiatrist. So this is going to be our next episode on depression. And in this will be a brief episode where I'm going to go over an introduction to the treatments for depression and an introduction to the medications. And then starting on the next episodes, we'll have an episode on each category of the medications. So we look at the treatments. I've come up with a few categories here. First would be lifestyle recommendations. This could be categorized as like lifestyle psychiatry, nutritional psychiatry. There's some subfields that some folks are researching and practicing out there. And I'll briefly go over some of those lifestyle recommendations. It's not dissimilar from the lifestyle recommendations that are made for other medical issues, but I think it's somewhat of a newer field of study where it's being looked at for depression and mental health treatment. Then I'll briefly go over some of the psychotherapy modalities that are available out there, talk briefly about some of the complementary therapies and somatic therapies, and then we'll get into the antidepressant medications. So, lifestyle recommendations. There's actually a board, an American board of lifestyle medicine, and they have their pillars of treatment. And for mental health, I've kind of paralleled those two together. So when we first think about lifestyle recommendations, nutrition would be the first thing that would come to mind. So this is what you're eating. And there's actually a lot of studies that have come out recently showing that improving your diet actually has benefit for depression, anxiety, etc. And I have a whole episode that we'll do in the future where we talk about those studies, we talk about what improvements we're seeing. But here I just want to briefly go over just an overview of what specific changes to diet could lead to an improvement in mental health symptoms and specifically depression. So the Mediterranean diet is often, something thrown out there as like a very healthy diet. So that's, I think of fresh foods. So not having a lot of processed foods. And when you're eating, and so grains are often processed, meaning that the proteins are taken out, the bran or the fiber on the grains are taken out. So this would be something like white rice when compared to brown rice, or whole wheat as compared to white flour, things like that. So keeping things more in their more natural, less processed states. And so we think of things like whole grains. That'd be like I said, brown rice, oats, whole grain oats, steel cut oats, barley, like whole barley, and most breads are processed because they use flour that's been where the bran has been taken off. And when you see the whole wheat bread, typically that's just kind of they're putting the powder back in. It's not that the bread was cooked, because it's quite difficult to make bread. There's a few different types of breads out there that use sprouted grains, but we're talking about you see the actual grain in its whole form with the fiber on it. And then typically these take longer to cook. There's a few. One specifically would be bulgur wheat, which actually cooks pretty quickly. You actually don't even have to boil it actively. You can just add hot water to it and it soaks it up, and it can cook in as quickly as 10 minutes. So bulgur wheat, I think, is a good option for a whole grain that cooks quicker. Quinoa would be another one that cooks pretty quickly. So people are often, they don't have 45 minutes to cook some of the whole grains and they take a lot longer. There are options there. But I'll go into these in a lot more detail in a later podcast. But so whole grains would be one part of this unprocessed diet, fish, and then limiting your meat and dairy. And so some of the diets that are out there, as I said, the Mediterranean diet, there's the DASH diet, that's the cardiac diet. Low carb diets are out there, keto. I know there's a lot of controversy. I mean, there's a lot of controversy about this topic in general. There's not very clear information, but I think that, I mean, that applies to just about anything. That applies to the treatments that we're going to talk about for mental health. There's a lot of controversy of, do these work? Do they not work? Have the studies been done correctly? How much benefit is there? So, you know, I'm going with the best information that I have in my opinion that I'm giving to you. So, you may not agree with everything I say. I know this that diet is a very hot topic that people have very strong opinions about, and I'm one of those people that has strong opinions. And this is my podcast, so I'll give you my opinions. But I do want to, kind of predicate that with we have some studies that show this, but there's not as much information as we would like to have. But I think, and when you look at the studies that have been done on this for mental health, the elimination of processed foods the is kind of across the board what's shown the most difference. And so I think about that of you're shopping more along the outside of the grocery store, you're in the produce section, you're in the dairy section, you're in the meat sections, and nothing has really been done to them other than, they've been picked and put in boxes and shipped to the store if they're fruits and vegetables. And if they're meats, have gone through the meat plant and cut off, and you've got the raw cut piece of meat that has nothing added to it. And typically, one way to tell the difference between something that's been processed and something that's not been processed is things that have not been processed tend not to have nutritional labels attached to them. So they don't say, this is how many calories, this is how much fat, this is how much, they tend not to have that. And even if they do have that, they don't have a list of ingredients. You pick up an apple, it doesn't say there's an apple in here, right? If you pick up a steak, it doesn't say there's beef in here because that's the only thing that's there, right? So unprocessed foods typically are sold in their most raw form. If we've done something to them, and that, I mean, and not everything you do to these things, in many cases, canning things, canned tomatoes, for example, um, that's minimally processed. When you read the ingredients, it says tomatoes and maybe salt. And some of them have like some other things added to them, but a lot of them are just purely like the vegetable, and usually there's some salt or preservative in there. Another example of a processed item that I would say would still be on the healthy side would be frozen, right? So if you're buying frozen peas, there's just peas in there. Okay. So processing in and of itself is not bad. In fact, I've read studies about, where they've looked at different levels of processing, whereas you might have like an apple versus applesauce versus, apple jam, right? And it's really those highest levels, what we would call ultra processed foods, that are the worst. And these foods, they often have a lot added to them. And there's very frequently sugar in there that's added in. A lot of oils, particularly vegetable oils, um, and things like that are put into them. And so having a diet that's less of these ultra processed items and more in their whole form, what we've seen is that can help with mood, and just health and other medical issues in general. Okay, so moving on to the next item of lifestyle recommendations would be physical activity. So, everyone always says diet and exercise, diet and exercise. but do people actually know what is good about each of those that they should be doing? And that's why we're going to have the other podcasts that I'll do on these topics. And so, just kind of a summary for physical activity. If you get 30 minutes of cardio per day, about 5 to 7 days a week, you're maxing out your benefit from a mental health standpoint, as far as a lot of studies show. So it may sound like a lot to some people and like not that much to other people. It really kind of depends on what your activity is. And I think, like with the diet, the real trick here is to find a way to do it for you that works for you, right? You may say, I don't like salads. Well, you don't, salads are not your only option. There may be foods that are in this healthy group that do suit what you like, right? I like fruit. I make fruit smoothies. I don't add any sugar to them and I don't feel like they need them. And to me, that's a snack. It's a dessert, but I haven't, I've just taken frozen fruits and I've added things like peanut butter powder or protein powder or oats or cinnamon, um, kefir I like to use, which is kind of like a liquid yogurt, but a little different. Yogurt is another good option. So, taking some of these healthy foods and making something that you like that works for you. And like I said, I want to go into more detail about what all different things you could do to make this work for you at a later time. But now, just to kind of say, if you do this, it's like has a good chance of actually helping to improve depression. And so with physical activity, you got to find what works for you. I think a lot of people think, oh, I don't want to go to the gym. I don't want to run a treadmill. Well, there's so many other things you could do. It could be working on projects that you enjoy that involve moving around and lifting things and squeezing things and things like that. Gardening, different sports. There's so many activities where you could get this in that maybe is not what you think of when you get turned off from the idea of doing this. And so we want to give our patients a list of all the different, figure out what, let's go through. What do you like? What do you like to do? What are your interests? And then try to think about how we could make a physical activity out of that that gets that into their routine. And a lot of people, they don't have time. And so I think things like taking the stairs or maybe parking a little bit further away and things like that, where you can kind of work it into your regular day and it doesn't take up that much time. It's just something, instead of calling or sending an email or texting at the office, walk over to the person's office, right? And take the stairs if they're on a different floor. Maybe it takes a little bit longer, but I mean, I think having that face to face is good. And then you've gotten up and you've moved around. And most of, a lot of our jobs, and especially the newer jobs that have been popping up over the last several decades, they're more sedentary jobs. You're sitting, right? And so anything you can do to get up, to go somewhere, to do something, you know, rather than eat in your office, even if you bring your lunch, taking it somewhere else, getting outside, being outside and taking a little walk and having a little picnic, something like that. It's not going to take that much extra time, but it gets you up and out. And that's kind of what I want to think about when we're looking at getting physical activity in there, because, if physical activity was easy, everyone would do it. So we have to find what are some things that actually would be easy that maybe people haven't thought about. And another thing, so we mentioned the cardio, and we mentioned the decreased sedentary behavior. Then there's also resistance training, right? This is so important. And especially if you're at a heavier weight and you're trying to lose weight, if you don't do the resistance training, you're not, it's not going to be sustainable, because you're going to lose fat and muscle. And then what happens is people go off their diets and then they gain weight back and they gain more fat than muscle. And when you do this cycle over and over and over again, your body composition turns into greater fat, lesser muscle. But if you're doing the resistance training while you're doing it, and just being stronger in general is associated with an improved mood. There's a study that is out there that looks at grip strength, and improved grip strength has improved mood. And so you want to have, we want to find a way of getting the cardio in our routine and getting some resistance training. And that could be, doing a little hand squeezing thing while you're, sitting down doing something else. It could be, lifting things. It could be, carrying things. It doesn't necessarily have to be going to the gym and lifting weights, because I think for a lot of people that's monotonous and boring, and they lose interest easily. Try to find a way where you're doing something that's testing your strength, but also engaging you in an activity that you like to do. Okay. So, moving on to some other lifestyle recommendations, another important one is to decrease or eliminate toxins. And I would put tobacco in there, I would put alcohol in there, I would put any illicit substances in there. And once again, this is controversial. I would put those food additives. So, trans fats, which although the US government has banned, there can still be a small amount in there. If you have, I think it's like, if you have 0.49% in your product, or you can round down to zero. And also, if you overcook certain cooking oils, they can turn into trans fats. So, trans fats, and then I also put fructose in there. And I'm not talking about fruit, I'm talking about the added sugar, like the high fructose corn syrup. I think it's a toxin. I've read a lot about it. I believe that it's bad and that we should get it out of our systems. It's not the way our bodies are designed to work. And I'll cover that probably when I go over the obesity medicine lecture. I'll go into more detail on my opinions about added sugar, but I would list it as a toxin. Okay, so we got diet, exercise, elimination of toxins. Next, adequate sleep. So important. And people just don't get it. People are not getting enough sleep. And I think they know people, I think the average, there's a chart, and it shows like back in like the 1950s or something like that, people are getting on average like 9 hours of sleep. And now it's like 6. And it just goes down and down and down and down. And I think with a lot of the new, technology that's in our lives and things like that, it keeps us awake. And also, our lives become more complicated. Um, People are working more, lots of different reasons. And then they want to have time for themselves. And then, sleep takes the hit, and it hits you back when you don't get enough. And so really, like, it's so important. Like, a lot of people have trouble sleeping, but a lot of people could sleep, and they stay up doing things. And I understand why it's difficult, but it is so important, and we really need to work to try and get that better. So, next point, decrease stress. And so that's, you can decrease stress in many ways. One, doing some of, how these activities that I mentioned in the lifestyle recommendations. The medications could help, therapy could help. There's a lot of things, but we really want to try and get that stress controlled. And then next point, healthy relationships. So the better relationships you have with other people, the closer social ties you have with people, the better you're going to be. And that's something that, if you're having trouble in that area, that therapy can actually really help with. Help kind of look at how you're interacting with other people, and maybe how you could improve that to improve those relationships. And so that is another key lifestyle thing. And then these last two, I've heard some talks about these. These are not traditionally. There's, I think, the 6 lifestyle recommendations from like the American Board of Lifestyle Medicine that I mentioned before. Um, Diet, exercise, decrease toxins, sleep, stress, and relationships. And then these last two, I've heard, I think there was a book written about that included these, and I really like them. And one is spending time in nature. I think that, just, and even if you don't feel like it, just getting out and going to a park, or going on a little hike. Where I used to live in Virginia, there were little parks all over the city, and on a weekend, I would find one on a map, go there, and do a little hiking trail. And sometimes it'd be like an hour, sometimes it would be longer, um, sometimes it would be even shorter. I would actually go to a laundromat and do my laundry. And there was a little park like really close to the laundromat. And while my clothes were washing, I would go to that park. I would drive over to that park. I would do like a 20, 30-minute walk around, and then I would go back, put my laundry in the dryer, and then I'd go back and do another little walk again. And rather than, driving home and being there for 15 minutes, I would do that while I was doing my laundry, trying to make the best use of my time. And I mean, not only am I then exercising, I'm also in nature. And, just I think being around trees and hearing the birds chirping, and, seeing, a river or waterway, it's serene, and it really makes you feel better. And so, and nature's all around us, whether you live in the city or a country or wherever. And I think, like I said, I was able to access it right around the corner from my laundromat, right? They're really everywhere. And there were different trails, and I would take a little different route each time and listen to podcasts sometimes, and sometimes just kind of sit with my thoughts. But I think spending that time in nature, and, it could just be sitting in nature, having a picnic outside, like I said before, just getting outside. That can really have a lot of benefits for your mental health. And then moving on to the last one, which is another one that I kind of tack on there, it's learning new things. So just being curious about the world. And I mean, I think reading just in general, if you just read a book, read a newspaper, read a magazine, just be reading, just educating yourself. And it could be that you're wanting to learn about a hobby. It could be watching a YouTube video. It could be listening to this podcast. You're learning new things, right? I listen to a ton of podcasts. I'm always trying to increase my knowledge about things. So, and you can make hobbies out of them. Maybe you want to learn to cook or bake or whatever, right? And you like watch videos, and you know, I think a lot of people, they get like, I love YouTube. Like I really like, I love it. I think that it gets it, like anything, especially with like a lot of the social media and internet and things, it can be used in healthy or unhealthy ways. And I think if you're just kind of clicking through and watching a 20-second clip, or a minute clip, or you're just like watching it, you're not doing anything, that you're not really getting the benefit out of it. When I was in college, I used to watch the Food Network all day, every day. I loved the Food Network. Not a huge fan about the new Food Network shows, but like the old ones where they had like a lot of cooking instruction, I just thought it was amazing. I thought, oh my gosh, I mean, this is before podcasts and before YouTube. So like it was hard to learn new things without a book, right? And I'm not that I'm against reading, but it's harder to kind of learn things when you're reading them, when you can actually see somebody doing it and engaging with it. And then you can be like, okay, they did it this way. Because you can read about it and then you make a mistake and you're like, hey, it didn't come out, the way that I wanted it, that they said it would, and it doesn't look like the picture. But if you actually physically see somebody doing it, and that's why I really, like I said, I used to love, I would watch the Food Network every day after, I did my college and my coursework, and I would go to the grocery store and I would buy ingredients from the recipes that I wanted to try, and I would cook new things. Like every week, I would try like new recipes. And then with YouTube, wow, you can access anything. Like just like this podcast, people are giving this information to you for free. You just go on there, search what you want to learn, and someone shows you how to do it. Like I'm raising chickens right now. I would have had no idea how to do this without YouTube. I've watched so many YouTube videos on raising chickens, like how to build a chicken coop. Like I've never built anything with wood and tools and nails and screws and stuff. Like it's just not something that I was a part of my growing up. I didn't learn those things. And so I think if you are able to see that, right? So like I built a coop. I built a chicken run. I built an auto feeding system. I've ordered stuff for an auto watering system I'm going to build, and it's fun, doing these new things, learning new things, and seeing it work, and like being able to watch people show that are experts, or a lot of them aren't even experts. They're people like me that learned how to do it, and then they want to show other people how to do it. But these are people that have had successes and failures, and they tell you what their successes and failures are. And then I think rather than just watching it and just kind of being entertained and then moving on, but to actually take the step of going and getting the supplies and doing it yourself, it just it works wonders. And I mean, that's why I've added this to the list of lifestyle recommendations. I really think that like learning new things, no matter how you do it, just makes such a huge difference. So that wraps up the lifestyle recommendations section. Kind of briefly went through that. Let's talk about therapy, because I kind of, I'm kind of thinking about these in order too, right? So I think of lifestyle recommendations is kind of the first line of defense. Like, let's do these things first. Then, if that doesn't work, and we're depressed, right? That doesn't work. We don't have enough motivation to get ourselves going. Like, the depression is too strong, or like we can't do it. We can't get into it. Let's move up to therapy. Therapy is our next step, right? I think of meds as really kind of not the last, but like one of the later things that we were going to want to try, right? So next thing we try therapy. Um, I'm just going to go through a few different types of therapy. I'm not really a therapist. I do know about it, but we're not going to talk a whole lot about it on the show. But I do want to bring it up because I think it is so valuable. Um, and unfortunately, we don't have enough therapists to go around. I mean, if you want a med, you can probably get a med, right? Family medicine will give them to you. Like, you can go to almost any doctor and get some medication. But therapy, it's a lot harder to come by. And so I think a lot of people end up on medication when maybe therapy would help because they just didn't have access to it. And it's unfortunate. And hopefully, we do better with that in society, with having access to that improve. But I just want to talk about some of the therapies. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, I think a lot of people is probably familiar with that. It's, where we kind of identify how we think and what kind of some automatic thoughts are, and what we feel like that means for us, and then what behaviors we have as a result of that, and where's maybe we could improve. Maybe we have some cognitive distortion. We're thinking about things not quite the right way, and we can change the way we think about things, and then we can change our reactions to those things. That's kind of the basic idea of cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's really helpful, of course, to have somebody guide you in that process. And so studies have been done, and generally when you compare meds and therapy, there's equal effectiveness, especially for mild to moderate depression. And when you combine them, it's best for, more severe, moderate to severe level. We recommend combining them, and generally there's more effectiveness when you use both together. And actually, in the STAR-D trial, they showed that there was additional 31% of patients recovered when they had therapy and medications together. And we'll talk a little bit more about the STAR-D trial, which is like the big, huge antidepressant trial that was done a long time ago, a little bit later in our depression series. So that's cognitive behavioral therapy. There's other types of therapy, interpersonal therapy, that deals with, helping you to how you interact with other people, and kind of analyzing how you're interacting with other people and how that might be contributing to how well you're doing. Group therapy, I really like group therapy. Um, when I did my training in San Diego, there was a great therapist there that did group therapy, and I just saw such amazing results. Like, she was so good at it, and the patients really responded. And I think there's so many benefits to this. One, you can have one therapist for like 10 to 15 patients. So it helps with that. We don't have enough therapists to go around. We can treat more patients at the same time. And then also, people learn from each other. If you're not someone who wants to engage that much, you can kind of sit back and kind of observe other people engaging until you feel comfortable. And so, someone that might not engage with one on one therapy is maybe able to like more slowly come out. And then also, I think seeing that other people are dealing with the same issues that you're dealing with is so helpful. And then seeing how somebody else maybe is a little further along than you, and them describing how they went through something and overcame it can really help you think, oh, maybe if they did it, then I could do it, and that's how they did it. Um, Interestingly, when I bring group therapy up to patients, they typically, I would say almost universally, do not want to do it. It's people, I think, people that suffer from mental health issues, they're embarrassed of what they're dealing with. They don't want others to know about it. They want to keep it to themselves. That they don't feel comfortable being in that environment. And so like I would often sell it as, well, this is not really group therapy. It's more like a education. It's more like a class. They're just kind of teaching you techniques. And some group therapies are that. They're just kind of teaching you sleep hygiene or, you know, techniques and things like that. And it's not necessarily necessitating your engagement. But you know, if you're a patient out there and you're listening, I just think group therapy is so amazing. And I know you might feel reticent to do it, and it's like, oh man, the thing is, the other people there, they're dealing with the same stuff you are. There's no shame, and there's no shame to begin with, but you don't need to feel that shame because you're all in this. And you, I think a lot of people, they want that one-on-one attention. I think that's another thing that, they think, oh, I want to have that time with that therapist. I want to be able to engage with them the entire time just to talk about my issues. But one, there, you might have better access if you do it this way. And also, you're going to learn from other people. And I think you're just going to feel better like, oh my gosh, other people actually do feel that way. I mean, I can tell, hey, I treat 100 patients that have the same issue. But whenever you actually see somebody else that's saying it, so that's my plug for group therapy. And then the last type I'm going to mention is psychodynamic psychotherapy. The that's the type of therapy that has traditionally kind of come sort of from Freud, and it's changed a little bit since then, but it's rooted in stuff that Freud came up with. And it's the type of therapy that I think most frequently psychiatrists that do therapy are doing. That tends to be more of, you don't have to be a psychiatrist to do psychodynamic psychotherapy, but it's something I had to do 2 years of supervision in residency. I had one patient my third year of residency, and I had supervision on that. And then I had another patient and did supervision on that. And I was, supposed to be doing psychodynamic psychotherapy with them. So in my program, we did a lot of training on that. I don't really like it personally. It's just not my thing, but it it's and I think it's just as effective as any other. And so some patients respond to some therapies better than others, and this is a very intensive therapy. You're going like every week, often 2 to 3 times a week. um, and you're digging in. This is when you're interpreting dreams, and you're interpreting like everything. And it's a really difficult type of therapy to actually do for a patient. And it often takes a patient that's more aware of themselves and more cognitive of kind of their own processes and thoughts to be able to engage with. But it's another type out there. It's effective. It works for a lot of people. And so, and then I think I mentioned this before, when we compare medicine to therapy, the remissions of for therapy, it takes longer for you to get better, like 12 to 18 months on average, but it typically is longer lasting. And then the limitations I kind of mentioned, it can be costly. It takes a lot more time. And I think that's another thing. Some people want all that time. They want to come in like 1, 2 times a week. But a lot of people are like, I don't have time for this. I work, I got stuff going on. Just give me a med. I'll come and see you for like 30 minutes once a month, maybe less. And so it is a time investment, and patients are often patients are often very resistant to it. Like they don't, they don't want to open up about these things. They find it challenging, and they struggle with facing a lot of this stuff, and it can trigger a lot of their symptoms to get worse. And so that can be a struggle. Whereas like taking a medication is this, I don't have to think about this. I pop this pill once a day, boom, I'm done. A lot of people hate taking meds because they're like, I don't want to put anything in my body that's not natural. And we can talk about that topic and what I think about that kind of statement later. But you've got those patients that are resistant to meds that in that way. But then you got patients that are resistant to therapy. They're like, oh, I don't believe in this, and I don't want to deal with this. Just give me a pill, doc, and I'll take it. So there's some resistance. And I think in general, you give the treatment that the patient is willing to accept. If somebody's like, hey, I want to take a med, and you're thinking, hey, yeah, a med might help, give them the med. Because the treatment that somebody is willing to do is the one that's more likely to work. Don't try and push something down someone's throat that they just really, it's like if somebody wants to quit smoking, doesn't want to quit smoking, telling them over and over and over how bad it is and that they need to quit is really not going to do a whole lot of good. They've got to be kind of ready to accept it, or to at least say, what, I'd like to, I don't think I can, but I'd like to at least get to some, right? And then also limit availability, which I mentioned. So, and I want to talk about this one um, thing about therapy. So I hope my slides are working this time. I apologize. The last video I shot also didn't work. So I'm trying every time. So if you've got the slides out, because the slides are available on the website, and hopefully it's working on YouTube. One thing I really want to do in this podcast that I think is different than a lot of other ones is I want to talk about basically like every treatment that's out there. Okay. And so if there's some new med or new treatment or new thing that's out there, I want us to discuss it. And so that's why I've thrown Rejoin in there. So Rejoin, REJOYN, is the first FDA cleared prescription smartphone therapy app based digital therapeutic. That was a mouthful. So basically, it's FDA cleared. So FDA approved and FDA cleared are a little bit different. When you FDA clear approved is what we have to do for medications and some medical devices and other things have to be, they're FDA approved. And basically that means that the benefit outweighs the risk. And so you have to prove that something works, and you have to prove that if it has adverse effects, that the likely benefits someone's going to have outweigh those risks. So if there's a chance someone's going to die, or there's a chance they're going to be cured, that treatment may be not very likely to be FDA approved. And then FDA cleared is kind of a lower level where it's like, well, this isn't harmful. It's kind of equal to some other stuff that's out there. You don't have to have as rigorous of proof, and there are devices and things that are not medications that often are FDA cleared. So this Rejoin was FDA cleared actually, and when I mentioned that I want to go through everything, this was actually approved in March of this year. We're in 2024 right now. This is something that came out in 2024. I'm not even sure if it's available quite yet. It said it will be available in late 2024. And so what it is, it's classed as a medical device. It's an app on your phone for the treatment of major depressive disorder. It's a 6-week program. You have to be 22 years or older, and it's actually prescribed. So you can't just go download the app. You have to have, I'm not exactly sure how this works, because it's not really out there yet, and I don't know, how good it is or whatever. I have no experience with it. I want to cover it. I want to cover everything in this podcast so we can actually go over absolutely everything that is available. So what it has is it's got these brain training exercises and short skills based therapy lessons. So it's a little bit like therapy from an app. And so what I'm guessing is it takes you through like some games that maybe like kind of train your brain in a way, and then maybe it's like some psychoeducation where they're kind of teaching you about like how to good sleep hygiene and things like that. Like I said, I don't know exactly what's in there, but it says brain training exercises and short skills based therapy lessons. And it's actually only approved to be used with medication. So you have to be taking medication and then get a prescription for this, and then you can get this. It's unclear whether insurance is going to cover this. And then you're probably wondering, how effective is it? Well, I read the study and the results aren't terribly good. Um, if this were a drug, it would probably not be FDA approved. So on this a particular type of depression scale, it's the MADRS scale. Uh, it's one of the scales we use to rate depression. I believe 60 is the highest, most severe depression. So the average patient had a 28. And remember, these patients are already on medication. So these are basically patients that are taking medication and, you know, are still moderately depressed. And so they're at a 28 out of 60. And when they use this app, their score dropped to 19. And so you're thinking, wow, that sounds pretty good, 28 to 19. But then placebo was 21. And, how do you do a placebo for an app? I'm not even sure like how that was done. It says sham treatment. I'm not really sure what they did. But, so you've dropped to 19 with the app and 21 with placebo. And it was not statistically significant. And so I guess on the one hand, and when I was a medical student thinking about going to psychiatry, I was in a psychiatrist's office. It was community care. It was a community care rotation, and I wanted to go into psychiatry, so I picked a psychiatrist. And so I was in this psychiatrist's office that was doing community care, and around that time there was that study that came out that basically showed that antidepressants at mild and moderate levels were no better than placebo, and at severe I think it was at low at mild depression there was no difference from placebo. With moderate there was a difference, but it wasn't statistically significant, and at severe there was a statistically significant difference, but barely. And so it was on 60 Minutes. It was like this is like back in 2011 or 12. um, and I was like, wow, these meds don't work. you know and I brought this up to the doc I was working with, and I said, what do you think about this? And he said, well, if you don't come see me, you don't get the placebo. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I mean, basically what he's saying is, uh, these don't work better than placebo, but placebo works. And it's like, you can't go to the store and buy a placebo, right? You can't just get a placebo. You actually have to do something to get the placebo effect. And right in the studies, what we do is, we give people a treatment that's not the real treatment, but they think might be the real treatment, and they get better. And so they're actually taking something, right? They're taking like the sugar pills, is commonly what the placebo is called, right? But um, if you don't think you're getting something that's going to make you better, you can't get the placebo effect. And so I guess this app, if you don't have access to therapy, and this gives something equal to a placebo response, and a placebo response is significant, and you're not putting a new medication into your system that's causing adverse effects, then perhaps this is a good idea. I mean, if you drop from a 28 to a 19, which is equal to what a placebo would have done, you can't just buy a placebo off the shelf, then hey, maybe this is a good option. I don't know how much it's going to cost, that's something to be considered. But I think a lot of this, there's going to be a lot more stuff like this that's going to be coming out, and this is the first one. This is the first um, prescription smartphone therapy app that's ever been FDA cleared. And so there's probably going to be more. I think there was one for something else that came out a while back, and it's kind of gone away. And I don't remember what it was for, but we might be seeing more of this. And hey, if we can get a placebo out of it, and that's a good effect, then like the guy that the doc I worked with, if you don't come see me, you don't get the placebo. So Something to think about. All right, let's talk about complementary and somatic therapies. So I think the lifestyle stuff is what I would try first. Then I would be looking at therapy, and then I'd probably be looking at medications, and then I'd be thinking about complementary therapies. And then the somatic therapies is the last one. That would kind of be the last thing I'm kind of thinking on my list. And so, what are complementary therapies? This is like over the counter type of stuff, right? Vitamins, minerals, St. John's wort, L-methylfolate, SAMe, those type of treatments. So I'm actually going to cover meds first because there's a lot more evidence that the meds work than this other stuff does, and I think it's like more important. But I wanted to just kind of sum it up here before we go into medications, because I want to do like a summary of all the different treatments, um, and we'll go into detail on these. But there hasn't been as much research on them. I think these the ones that I list are the ones that I think are the ones that I would advise at the top of the list. So those are complementary and there's a lot of other ones, and the other ones, I think there either is little to no evidence or they're just kind of nonsense. And the St. John's wort, SAMe, L-methylfolate, those are there is evidence that those could be helpful. And where this really comes into play is, you've got the patient, the patient that says, I don't take medications. I don't want to put something unnatural in my body. Now, St. John's wort is a plant which contains an SSRI in it, essentially. And it's a little messier, but we'll talk about it later. But they might be more amenable to taking that. So I'm not going to take this Prozac, but I'll take the St. John's wort. And you can't prescribe it, but you could advise them, okay, well, what would you think about taking something like this? I would, and you could advise them how to take it, what dose, what brand that you think is reputable. Because the thing is, the FDA is the Food and Drug Administration, right? And these are foods. So these complementary therapies are rated as foods. So everything that's kind of in that vitamin aisle at the grocery store or the store or wherever, the drugstore, those are food, even though they're not really, but they're classified as food. And food has way less rigorous checks on it. To get a drug approved, you have to do so much more work to get a drug approved. You can basically just kind of throw this out there, say it's a food, say it works, and the FDA will approve it and it's on the shelf. That doesn't mean it's any good. So you could have 10 St. John's wort's products, and some of them might have almost none in it, even though they say they do. And it's like melatonin. They've done studies on melatonin where they've seen that there's like a 400-fold difference between one, even the same within the same brand with different batches. And so it's just not well controlled. And that's why I would generally not advise this. But if you have a patient that's against meds, but might be for this, and then we'll talk about maybe some reputable brands, you could advise, hey, try this brand. I would take this dose. This is how I would take it. This is what I would look out for. It could interact with these things. Basically give them the talk and let them, manage it themselves. So we'll go, but there is evidence that these can be helpful. So we'll go over some of those complementary therapies, and then lastly will be the somatic therapies. So these are, somatic is the body, right? So these are kind of these are not things that you're putting inside your body. They're things that you're basically putting on your body, or I mean, in some cases in your body, but they're more like procedures. Okay, so things like electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, where you give shocks and cause small seizures. Phototherapy, that would be where you have like a light box that's shining light that's supposed to be mimicking, the light from the sun to improve your mood. Vagal nerve stimulation. I've never seen anyone that's had one of these. I've never heard of anyone having it. It's a very invasive procedure where you have this device surgically implanted inside you to stimulate your vagal nerve. And then there's TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulations. This is a machine that you sit in that has a magnet on your brain. It blasts these magnetic signals into your brain. And then cranial electric therapy. This is low wave electrical signals, like an alpha stimulator, where you put the little electrodes on your earlobes, and it puts a low wave electrical signal across from one earlobe to the other. And I'm going to go through all of those 5 somatic therapies at the very end of the depression series. And so that brings us up to where we're going to start on antidepressant medications. And so I think this is a good stopping point. And next time we'll cover a little intro to the antidepressants, how they work, a list of them, what the different categories are, some history of, what came out first, what's on the horizon. So just do kind of a little summary of antidepressants, and then we'll step into MAOIs, which are MAOIs and TCAs. The first ones came out the first in the same year, but I think of MAOIs kind of first because they're a bigger gun. That doesn't mean that, by bigger gun, I mean that they do more in your body. They're more potentially more powerful and dangerous, but not necessarily better. We'll go over the MAOIs, and then we'll go over TCAs, the tricyclics, and then we'll get into SSRIs, SNRIs, etc. And we'll go down through all the antidepressants. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you learned a lot about the different treatments available for depression, and that you're ready to learn about the medications that we use to treat depression. I'll see you next time.